Gray skies blanketed the town of Hollow Creek, a remote corner of the Wild West in 1873. Cold winds blew through the dusty streets, shaking old wooden signs hanging in front of stores. Hollow Creek, once a vibrant stop for wagon trains and ambitious miners, is now a pale shadow of its glorious past. Amid that gloomy scene, Jack Holloway, a 28-year-old young police officer who had just moved from Boston, was slowly walking on the main street. His leather boots made a clacking sound on the old wooden planks, the sound echoing in the unusual stillness of the morning. Jack stroked his newly grown mustache, his sharp green eyes scanning the strange faces looking at him with both curiosity and suspicion. Before coming here, Jack had heard rumors about Hollow Creek, a place where law seemed like a luxury, where the line between right and wrong was as blurry as the morning mist that covered the town every morning. Bright, but with a burning ambition and belief in justice, he voluntarily accepted this task, determined to make a difference. When Jack pushed open the door and entered the police office, an old wooden building with dusty windows, he could not have imagined that in just a few hours, a horrifying case would thrust him into a bitter investigation. The hardest of his career, a case that will shake not only Hollow Creek but the entire United States. A scream ripped through the quiet atmosphere of Hollow Creek that afternoon. Jack was sitting in his cramped office, trying to get acquainted with old files, when that scream reached his ears. Without hesitation, he grabbed his gun and hat and rushed out the door. The source of the scream came from the edge of the forest west of town. When Jack arrived, a curious crowd had gathered around an ancient oak tree, and there, under the thick canopy of trees, was a sight that froze the blood in Jack's veins. A body was hanging from a tree branch, rotating gently in the wind like a giant scary puppet. It was a middle-aged man, wearing a luxurious black suit that was now wrinkled and bloody. The victim's face was distorted in extreme horror, his eyes wide open, as if still staring at the invisible murderer. Jack swallowed hard, trying to stay calm in front of the bustling crowd. He ordered everyone to step back and set up a protective ring around the scene. While waiting for the medical examiner, an old man named Thompson who lived on the edge of town, Jack began to observe closely. The first thing he noticed was the rope used to hang the victim. It was not an ordinary rope, but a special rope, braided from 3 different fibers with a complex technique. Jack had never seen such rope at Hollow Creek. Next, he noticed the deep cuts on the victim's wrists and ankles. These injuries were not caused by struggling while being hanged, but were clearly caused by a sharp object. It appears that the victim was tortured before his death. When Dr. Thompson finally arrived, the old man looked at the body and exclaimed in surprise, "My God, that's Judge Anderson!" This news spread like wildfire through the crowd. Judge Anderson, one of Hollow Creek's most powerful figures, known for his strictness and fairness, has now become the victim of a brutal murder. When Jack and Dr. Thompson carefully took the body down, he discovered another strange detail. In the judge's vest pocket was a small piece of paper, on which there was only one handwritten note: "Justice will be served." That night, as Jack sat in his office, his mind raced with questions. Who killed Judge Anderson? Why him? And what does that mysterious message mean? Little did he know, this is just the beginning of a horrifying chain of events that will shake Hollow Creek to its foundations. In the following days, Jack immersed himself in the investigation. He paged through Judge Anderson's file, interviewing dozens of witnesses, but every clue led to a dead end. The town of Hollow Creek is engulfed in a heavy atmosphere of fear and suspicion. On a gloomy Wednesday morning, as Jack sat in the local coffee shop, trying to put together the disparate pieces of the case, another scream rang out. This time, it came from an abandoned mine south of town. Jack's heart was pounding as he ran to the scene. In the bowels of a dark mine, another horrifying scene awaits. The body of a man was placed sitting on an old wooden chair, his hands tied tightly behind his back. But what made Jack shudder wasn't his victim's posture, but his face, or more accurately, the lack of it. The victim's face had been stripped off, leaving only a layer of terrifying bright red flesh. Dr. Thompson, on arrival, confirmed that this was done while the victim was still alive. Jack felt nauseous, but he knew he had to stay calm. As they carefully examined the body, Jack noticed a familiar detail: deep cuts on the wrists and ankles, identical to those on Judge Anderson's body. And in the victim's pocket, another piece of paper was found, still with the haunting words, "Justice will be served." It took nearly a day to determine the victim's identity. That was Frank Miller, local banker and one of Hollow Creek's wealthiest men. This news sparked a wave of panic in the community. The two most powerful people in town were brutally murdered within just a few days. Jack began to notice a pattern. Both Judge Anderson and Frank Miller held important positions in Hollow Creek. They were all tortured before they died. And the same mysterious message was left on their bodies. As night fell, Jack sat in his office, crime scene photos and investigative notes scattered across his desk. He feels he is facing a serial killer, one with complex motives and brutal methods. But what motivated him? And more importantly, who will be the next victim? Suddenly, a thought flashed into Jack's head. He hurriedly searched through a pile of old files and found a yellow document from 20 years ago. That was the verdict in a controversial case in which Judges Anderson and Frank Miller played key roles. A case whose outcome changed the fortunes of many people in Hollow Creek. As Jack read through the documents, he felt he was getting closer to the truth. But he didn't know that the murderer was also watching his every move and preparing for his next play. The bright sunlight of a summer afternoon did nothing to ease the tense atmosphere surrounding Hollow Creek. In front of the police office, a crowd gathered, shouting for justice. Jack stood behind the old wooden door, listening to screams of anger mixed with fear. "Holloway, what are you doing in there?" The shrill voice of Mrs. Martha, the grocery store owner, rang out clearly. "You two are dead. Who will be next?" Jack clenched his fists, a feeling of helplessness rising. He knew he was racing against time, but all the clues were too vague. At that moment, the phone rang, and Sheriff Johnson's voice echoed from the neighboring town. "Holloway, I just received a report from the governor. He's not happy with your progress. If you don't have a breakthrough in the next 48 hours, they'll send in a federal investigation team." That threat was like a bucket of cold water splashed in Jack's face. He knew if the FBI took over the case, his chance to prove his abilities would disappear. But how could he find the decisive clue in just 2 days? That night, while Jack was poring over a pile of files, a gentle knock sounded on the door. Outside was Sarah, the 17-year-old daughter of Frank Miller, the second victim. Her eyes were red from crying, but in those eyes, Jack recognized an extraordinary determination. "Mr. Holloway, I think I know something that might help your investigation," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Jack invited her inside, filled with both hope and worry. Sarah said that a few days before he was murdered, her father received a strange letter. He burned it immediately after reading it, but Sarah accidentally saw part of the contents. There was a sentence in that letter, Sarah recalls, that said, "20 years of silence has been enough. It's time for the truth to be revealed." Sarah's words were like lightning hitting Jack's mind. He quickly pulled out an old file he had found earlier, a case from 20 years ago involving Judge Anderson and Frank Miller. As Jack turned the pages, a dark picture gradually emerged. That case involved the death of a young miner named Michael Collins. Officially, the death was concluded as an occupational accident. But there were discrepancies, conflicting testimony, and a controversial decision from Judge Anderson, backed by the bank run by Frank Miller. Suddenly, everything began to come together in Jack's mind. The message, "Justice will be served" on the victims' bodies, torture marks, and now the mysterious letter. Is the killer seeking revenge for the death of Michael Collins? But when Jack was lost in thought, a scream rang out from outside. He hurriedly ran out, only to witness a horrifying scene. In the middle of the central square, a body was burning fiercely, flames mercilessly licking the dark night. The fire burned fiercely, swallowing the struggling body in the middle of the square. The victim's screams mixed with the crowd's screams of horror. Jack rushed into the fire, trying to save people, but it was too late. When the fire extinguished, only a charred body remained, distorted beyond recognition. In the flickering light of the streetlight, Jack recognized a familiar piece of paper lying near the body, the edge slightly burned. He bent down to pick it up, and as expected, the haunting words appeared. Justice will be served. But this time, there's something different. Below the familiar text is a new message. The clock is ticking. The truth will be revealed where it all began. Jack scanned the square, hoping to find signs of the murderer, and then, for a moment, he caught sight of a dark shadow passing around the corner of the street. Without hesitation, Jack rushed after him. The chase takes place through the dark, winding alleys of Hollow Creek. Jack could hear hurried footsteps ahead, but the dark figure was always a step away from him. They ran through the deserted night market, crossed an old wooden bridge over a stream, and finally headed towards the abandoned mine, where Frank Miller's body was found. As Jack entered the mine area, silence enveloped him. The sound of footsteps fell silent. In the dim moonlight, old, rusty machines create strange shapes like monsters lurking in the dark. "I know you're here," Jack shouted, gun cocked. "Show yourself!" A dry laugh rang out, reverberating from many directions, making it impossible for Jack to determine the exact location. "What do you think you understand, Holloway?" A deep voice spoke up. "You're just an outsider who doesn't understand Hollow Creek's bloody history." Jack tried to stay calm, moving carefully among the old mining equipment. "I know about Michael Collins," he said. "I know about the case 20 years ago, but murder is not the way to get justice." The laughter rang out again, this time closer. "Justice? No, Holloway. This isn't just about justice. This is about the truth that Hollow Creek has buried for too long." Suddenly, a dark shadow rushed out from behind the pile of rocks, crashing into Jack. They struggled fiercely, rolling around on the rocky ground. In the dim moonlight, Jack caught a glimpse of the attacker's face, a face distorted with hatred and pain. The struggle lasted for a long time. Both were exhausted. But then, in a moment of carelessness, Jack exposed his ribs. The attacker quickly took advantage of the opportunity, pushing Jack down into a nearby deep hole. When Jack regained consciousness, he found himself tied up in a deep underground cave. In front of him, the murderer stood, holding a torch. The flickering light clearly illuminated his face, a face that Jack recognized from old photos in the case file from 20 years ago. "Welcome to where it all began, Holloway," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You want to know the truth? Then prepare, because the story I'm about to tell will shake Hollow Creek to its very foundations." The light from the torch danced on the cave's damp stone walls, creating eerie shadows. Jack tried to stay calm, not taking his eyes off the person standing in front of him, the man he recognized as Thomas Collins, brother of Michael Collins, the victim in the case 20 years ago. "You think you know the truth?" Thomas spoke, his voice filled with bitterness. "You've only scratched the surface of it, Holloway." Thomas began to tell the story, his voice low as if he were reminiscing. 20 years ago, Michael Collins, then only 22 years old, discovered a rich gold mine in this area. Instead of reporting to the mining company, Michael approached local banker Frank Miller, hoping to obtain capital to mine himself. But Frank Miller saw more than just an opportunity to get rich, Thomas said, his eyes sparkling with indignation. He saw a gold mine that could change the fate of the whole town, and he didn't want to share it with a young miner. According to Thomas, Frank Miller was secretly associated with Judge Anderson and several other powerful figures in town. They planned to steal information about the gold mine from Michael. When Michael refuses to cooperate, they stage an accident in the mine. "They killed my brother," Thomas growled, his tears glistening in the torchlight, and then covered it up as a normal industrial accident. Judge Anderson ensured that no investigation was conducted. Jack felt his throat tighten. If what Thomas said is true, this is not just a simple murder, but a conspiracy of corruption and cover-up on a large scale. "But why wait 20 years to act?" Jack asked, trying to buy time while trying to find a way to escape his bonds. Thomas smiled bitterly. "I tried to get justice in a legal way, but every effort was blocked. They were too strong, too influential. I had to leave Hollow Creek, rebuild my life, and wait for the opportunity." Festival. Suddenly, a noise rang out from the cave entrance. Thomas was startled and turned around. Jack took advantage of this opportunity, using all his strength to push himself forward, hitting Thomas. Both fell to the ground, struggling violently. In the chaos, the torch fell and went out. Darkness covered the cave. Jack tries to escape the ropes while still dealing with Thomas. The sounds of panting, kicking, and growling from the two echoed in the cramped space. Suddenly, a ray of light flashed from the cave entrance. "Police! Stand still!" The familiar voice of Sarah, Frank Miller's daughter, rang out. She followed Jack and brought more people. In that unexpected moment, Jack found an opportunity to defeat Thomas. When the flashlight illuminated the scene, Thomas lay motionless on the ground, and Jack, although bruised, was still standing. As Thomas was handcuffed and led away, Jack looked him straight in the eyes. "If what you say is true, I promise to clear things up, but not by killing people." Sarah approached Jack, her face full of worry and confusion. "Mr. Holloway, is what he said true?" Jack looked at her, then looked out at the cave entrance where the dawn was breaking. "Sarah, I don't know what the whole truth is, but I promise you, we will find it, and this time, justice will truly be served." As they walked out of the cave, Jack knew that this was only the beginning. The case has been solved, but the secrets of Hollow Creek are still there, waiting to be exposed. The months that followed the crime were a tumultuous time for Hollow Creek. An extensive investigation led by Jack Holloway gradually revealed the dark truth behind Michael Collins's death 20 years ago. With assistance from the FBI and independent investigators, Jack uncovers evidence of a conspiracy between Frank Miller, Judge Anderson, and several other powerful figures in town. Not only did they cover up the death of Michael Collins, but they also engaged in a series of corrupt and illegal activities over the past 2 decades. The trial of Thomas Collins took place in a tense atmosphere. Although convicted of murder, with extenuating circumstances, and the truth revealed, Thomas received a much lighter sentence than initially expected. Meanwhile, many prominent Hollow Creek figures face criminal charges. Some have fled, others have to appear in court. The town falls into chaos as the old power structures break down. Sarah Miller, Frank's daughter, took over responsibility for running the local bank. With Jack's support, she implemented many reforms to ensure transparency and fairness in business operations. For Jack Holloway, this case changed his life forever. He is promoted to sheriff of Hollow Creek, with the mission of rebuilding the community's trust in the legal system. A year after the crime, at a memorial service for Michael Collins, Jack stood before the Hollow Creek community and said, "We have gone through a tumultuous year. Painful truths have been exposed, old wounds have been opened, but from the ashes of the past, we have the opportunity to build a future. A better future. A future based on truth, justice, and trust." When Jack finished his speech, he looked around the square. He saw familiar faces: Sarah Miller with a hopeful smile, Martha, the grocery store owner, nodding appreciatively, and even new residents who had come to Hollow Creek after hearing about the remined gold mine. Hollow Creek is gradually reviving. New buildings go up, new businesses are established, but most importantly, a new spirit is spreading in the community. The spirit of transparency, fairness, and solidarity. As dusk fell over the town, Jack stood on the top of the hill looking down at Hollow Creek. He knows that the road ahead still has many challenges, but for the first time in many years, hope is blooming in the hearts of every resident here. And somewhere in the breeze, Jack thought he heard a whisper. Justice has finally been served. But this time, it's not a threat, but a promise for a brighter future.